Well, ladies and gentlemen, good evening. I think it's probably time for us to get underway. I was just waiting for a few more people to turn up, but they will have to come in as we are presenting. Thanks very much for coming out this evening to the release of Mark Thomson's latest Cost of Defence. This has certainly become, I think, something of a Canberra institution now, Mark, number 15 in the collected series. So you know you're a real defence tragic if you've got 15 copies of Mark's book up on your bookshelf. And it remains, as it always has been, the go-to assessment, the plain English assessment, the realistic assessment of what Defence is doing with its budget. So we look forward to hearing from Mark. It's my pleasure to introduce Suzanne Birch, who's the Business Development Manager Maritime for Saab Systems. Saab has been a good friend of ASPI over quite a few years now in terms of its engagement with us, its sponsorship of us. And increasingly in this world, we need that level of business engagement for us to do our work. So, Suzanne, thank you very much for Saab's continuing support. And ladies and gentlemen, can you please welcome Suzanne, who will introduce Mark.
Good afternoon. Pleasure to be with you, and it's certainly fantastic to see so many people here this afternoon. I think it only goes to illustrate how popular and insightful the commentary from ASPI is in these kind of areas. So looking forward to hearing what Mark has got to say. Noting that you are all in fact here to listen to what Mark has to say about the budget, I will keep the remarks brief, but I did just want to follow on from what Peter said about Saab's long-standing relationship with ASPI. We certainly are very proud of our affiliation with the organisation and very proud to be sponsoring the event this evening. Now, I'm sure Mark has some quite sobering comments about the budget and what it means for defence industry, but I think it's fair to say that we are in an unprecedented time in the defence industry. It's certainly an exciting phase that we're going through, and once we move through the minor inconvenience of the caretaker period and the federal election, I'm sure we can get on with business. For Saab, it is in particular an exciting time. Over the next few years, we will have a number of milestones. We will we'll be part of the team that takes the final ANZAC platform through the highly successful ASMD program, something that we're very proud of. And we'll also move into our 30th year of operation in Australia. And having gone from a pretty modest team of Swedes back in the late 80s to what is now a pretty significant organisation of several hundred combat systems engineers, it's something that we're very proud of, and we'll certainly look forward to celebrating that with you as we move into 2017. Now on to what we're here for this evening. Last year my colleague Gerard Ogden introduced Mark as the man who needed no introduction, which I'm sure is reasonable, but I'll take just a slightly different tack and make a few comments about Mark's background. I'm probably one of the only people who wasn't aware that Mark actually entered the field of academia in the area of theoretical physics and held a number of research roles both in my home country of the UK as well as here in Australia before moving to join the Department of Defence in the mid-90s with a number of roles focused, as you might expect, on budget management as well as organisational change. I believe it was in 2002 that Mark joined ASPI as the inaugural director of the Budget and Management Programme, and it's in that capacity that Mark will speak with us this afternoon. And so without further ado, I'd like to say thank you and welcome Dr. Mark Thomson.
Peter, Suzanne, Saab, thank you very much. It's a great pleasure to be here and appreciate your sponsorship of the event. I've got to say up front, although my name's on the cover of the book, it's really much a team effort. There's a lot of people who go into bringing together the budget brief in the very short time it's produced, and to them I thank, and they know who they are. What I'm going to try and do tonight is tell you about this year's defence budget in the context of the white paper, but I'm going to do so centred pretty much on this graph you see here. It's a graph which shows 26 years of defence spending, well, 16 years of defence spending as it's actually occurred, and 10 years of defence spending as it's planned as per the white paper. And I'll come back to this on a number of occasions. Let me give you a quick tour of it. The dollars over here are next year's dollars. So everything's been corrected, so it's a single year's dollars. The grey columns here are the level of baseline defence funding. That's the money that Defence spends to do its day-to-day activities and recapitalise itself. And then little red slithers or boxes up the top here are the operational supplementation it receives for the operations it conducts on the behalf of government. The black line here, the dashed line, is a line representing 2% of GDP. And you can see where we are, we're just about here. Now, if you're wondering why this line flattens off in so many occasions when in fact we've had real GDP growth, the answer is because nominal GDP hasn't been as favourable as real GDP. And I'll come back to tell you that part of the story in a moment. The reason I've started with the big picture, a quarter century plus of defence spending here, is because I think there's some very important lessons we can learn about a couple of the previous epochs we've been through, which really provide a very important context for the white paper as we look forward. The first period of time I want to look at is this period here. It's the first 10 years on the graph, and essentially it's the 10 years that were covered by the Howard government's 2000 white paper. The final year there is technically part of the 2009 white paper, but because it provided no additional funding above and beyond what the Howard government provided, it's pretty much part of that original trajectory of growth which was begun back in 2001. Over that period, $10.7 billion were added to the defence budget in real terms, and the real growth rate over that period was 5.3% per annum. It represented a radical change. If I extended the graph off to the left there, what you would see right through the 90s and most of the 80s was a defence budget which oscillated from year to year with operational supplementation and with foreign exchange movements, because the rule was very simple for defence funding back in the day. That was, they got what they got last year corrected for inflation. And it was a pretty grim time for defence. It meant that capitalisation of platforms was constantly deferred. It was an era of fitted but for but not with, and it was also a period where a lot of supporting functions of the Defence Force were hollowed out, and indeed parts of the army removed wholesale from the order of battle. The period, of course, that I showed you there began with the 2000 white paper. The 2000 white paper was really an attempt to fill a gap between means and ends. There was a vision of what the Defence Force should look like. It wasn't a tremendously ambitious vision at that point. The vision was, we want to keep the Defence Force we've got. But there wasn't enough resources available in the budget going forward for that to occur. And the 2000 white paper was an attempt to redress the difference between what was planned and what was properly funded. Now, we don't know what would have happened without East Timor, but East Timor was, of course, the essential background to the 2000 white paper when it eventually came out. And it made the government and the nation sympathetic to bolstering the Defence Force, to remediate a lot of the shortcomings that were identified during the East Timor operation. And it did so by promising 3% real growth across the decade. But of course, as we know now, that was only the start. There was very quickly, almost hot on the heels of the white paper implementation, there was the events of 9/11, the deployment to Afghanistan, the deployment to Iraq, a deployment to the Solomon Islands, a deployment back into East Timor, another deployment into Afghanistan, so on and so forth. It was an extraordinary decade where the ADF was called upon time and time again to perform operations at short notice. It was also a period of time where the government found itself flush with funds. So in addition to the 3% of GDP, the Howard government on a series of occasions agreed specific big ticket items to bolster the capacity of the Defence Force. There was the purchase of the Super Hornet aircraft, there were the C-17 transport aircraft, and then there was the $11 billion Enhanced Land Force initiative, which flowed on from the Hardened Network Army initiative. And that's how you get from 3% to a final figure of 5.3% real growth across that decade. But it wasn't all smooth sailing. There were difficulties along the way, and in fact there's somewhat of a paradox. Although there was lots of money flowing in, the ambitions for what the Defence Force should look like kept on running ahead of the funding, so that by 2003, only 3 years into the implementation, it was necessary to have a look at what was planned and pare back plans. The Defence Capability Review of 2003 saw 2 frigates retired early, 2 mine hunters tied up, and the F-111s retired a decade earlier than was initially planned. Also over that period, notwithstanding the fact that the long-term prognosis was for tight funding, Defence handed back money on no less than 4 occasions. And I'm talking multiples of hundreds of millions of dollars at the end of the financial year. But the most serious setback to the Howard government's plans for the 2000 White Paper came in terms of the capital program. What you can see on this graph here, the bottom here, the red bars, are money which was planned to be spent in capital investment, which was deferred to some point in the future. And the deferred money you can see up here in the front. Now, there were some accelerations, there were some deferrals. The net result was about $8 billion worth of funding was deferred by 4 and a bit years into the future. $8 billion is several years worth of capital investment being delayed 4 years into the future. So it was a serious setback to the plans. Now, what was the cause of these deferrals and handbacks of capital investment funding? Well, there were a variety of issues. One was that a lot of projects at that time simply weren't delivering on the schedule that was envisaged. Industry wasn't delivering, so payments weren't made, so Defence had additional money. But more serious than that was the planned expansion of the force required projects to be conceived, to be planned, and to get government approval. And it turned out to be much more difficult to do this at the pace that was envisaged than it turned out to be. In part, at least, that was because in 2003 there was a new approach to capability development taken. The CNAID reforms saw the 2-pass process introduced, and it also saw the Defence Material Organisation formed as a quasi-independent part of the defence establishment. For all of these reasons, the net result was that although it was very easy to plan for capability, the reality was it was very much more difficult to deliver the capability when the time came. And that really is the first lesson, a lesson that we need to carry forward into the implementation of this forthcoming white paper, and that is that planning is much easier than actual delivery of capability. The second period of time I want to look at is an 8-year period of time, which begins in 2009, which is the end of the last period we looked at, and terminates here at 2016-2017, which is the first year of white paper funding. So really this is the connecting stage between the expansion of the Defence Force under the Howard government and the planned expansion of the Defence Force under whoever wins the next election. And one good thing to be said about the situation we're in now is that there's bipartisan agreement on defence funding. The 2016 white paper was very explicit, actually had numbers going out across the decade, and both sides of politics have now signed up to that. That's a better position than we've been in the last couple of elections, where we've gone to elections with the opposition planning to both have a fundamental review of the way defence is structured and to have a new white paper as soon as they hit the ground running. So at last we've got something approaching a bipartisan position on what the Defence Force should look like and what money will be made available to build the Defence Force. Well, over this intermediate period that connects the two, the start and the end, there was only about $3.2 billion worth of growth over those 8 years. It's compared with more than $10 billion across the first 10. Average rate of growth, 1.5% per annum. It's a pretty disappointing period. Of course, there's no secret here. This period here begins, and you can see from the GDP stalling just here, it begins with the global financial crisis. The good times of the 2000s, the resource boom, the years when Treasury would look at the books at the end of the year and find there was literally between 0.5% and 1% of GDP in revenue more than they expected, they were over. We moved into a period where at the end of the year, Treasury would look at the books and find there was 0.5% to 1% less money than they expected to get by way of revenue. Well, the white paper that really kicks off this next era here is the 2009 white paper. It was to be a 2008 white paper, but events in late 2008, in particular the fall of Lehman Brothers in September of that year, heralded the global financial crisis, and as a result it was deferred until April of 2009. It's easy to forget, in the comfort of the present, just how dark those days of the initial stages of the global financial crisis were. There were serious economists who thought that we stood on the cusp of another Great Depression. Now, we've had what has now been termed in retrospect the Great Recession. A Great Depression would have meant 30% unemployment. We got away here in Australia with much less, and even the United States and Europe for the most part got away with much less than that. But that was the situation that the government faced when they were pulling together the 2009 white paper. Most people expected that what they'd come up with was a pretty modest vision for the Defence Force and a correspondingly modest funding commitment to go with it. As it happened, in April of 2009, when the white paper came out, what we got was an expanded vision for the Defence Force. Essentially, the 2009 white paper reaffirmed every initiative that the Howard government had begun, including the expansion of the Army, which was probably the force structure initiative that looked most perishable once the operational tempo looked like it was going to decline. But no, it was preserved. But there was also an expanded vision for what the maritime force structure would look like. A lot of that was driven simply by the sequencing of the retirement of assets, but there's no ambiguity in going from 6 to 12 submarines, for example. It was an expanded vision for a more capable Defence Force. Well, it lasted 10 days, then came the 2009 budget. 2009 budget was when the global financial crisis reasserted itself. $8.6 billion was cut from the years that you could see across the forward estimates. And over the next 3 years, the next 3 successive budgets, all up about $19 billion of planned funding was either deferred into the future or outright cut out of the Defence Force. And that's why you see on the graph that levelling off. Because in funding terms, what was promised back in April of 2009 was a continuation of 3% real growth all the way out to 2018, and then 2.2% real growth for the next 2 decades that followed on after that. But as it turned out, it was not to be. There was a strategic reform program announced concurrent with the release of the 2009 white paper. It was supposed to free up $20 billion of funds across the decade. It only took a couple of years, but the tension between money being removed from defence made it simply untenable to try and secure savings from the organisation. So the strategic reform program eventually collapsed. Now, that's what happened. Understanding why it happened, I think, is very pertinent as we look to the future. And this is where the second lesson from the past, I think, needs to be taken as we look at the implementation of the 2016 white paper. What I have here on this graph is 2 things, one superimposed above the other. Here we have the red bars are the deferrals of defence funding. This is funding that was promised to defence in the white paper that was pushed out to somewhere in the future. I don't know where in the future it was pushed to because there was no visibility in terms of where the money was being pushed. I just know where it was taken from. And as well as the deferrals, there were outright cuts, money that was taken from defence with no pretense of it ever being given back to them. There was some pretense about it being a saving, but everyone knew it was simply a cut. What I have below here is the underlying cash balance. That is, whether the government projected to be in surplus or was projected to be in deficit in May 2012. And May 2012 was when the last tranche of cuts were inflicted upon defence. And what you can see is very, very interesting. Where the deficits were deepest in the early years after the onset of the global financial crisis, the cuts to defence were relatively modest. Now, this is no surprise. If you look back at the recessions of the early 90s and of the early 80s that occurred, same thing happened with defence funding then. Although the government went deeply into deficit, defence barely noticed what was going on. When defence starts to notice, when the defence starts to feel the pain, as they did here, was when the government thinks they can get back into surplus. And you can see here that in these first couple of years here where the government was projecting a surplus, they were doing so by taking money from a whole range of places. Defence wasn't the only one bearing the burden, but defence was bearing a large burden to get back into surplus. Once again, you look back in the 80s and 90s, not exactly the same pattern, but a very similar pattern. The pressure on defence funding comes not when you're in deficit, but when you're trying to get through into surplus. And there's a political context here that I think is worth making. This was, of course, a Labor government in power at the time. The last time a Labor government had delivered a surplus was 1989. So it was a political pot of gold to be able to deliver a surplus, and that's really the story of why defence funding was cut during that period. So the second lesson that we need to take forward, that is, don't stand between a politician and a surplus, even if you're the Department of Defence. Now, as history would have it, the plans to get back into surplus by 2012, 2013 fell apart when Australia's terms of trade went pear-shaped. The value of the commodities that we sell internationally crashed as the demand from China dissipated and new supply of those same commodities came online from a variety of sources. That slashed government revenues, and as a result there was no way the government could get back into surplus, which was great news for defence, because consistent with the model that I just gave you, defence funding went back up. It went back up first under the Gillard government and subsequently all the way through to the Abbott government. The fact that we're in deficit meant that the defence budget was in fact safe. And that's where you see the recovery after 2012 in that 8-year period that I showed you. Now, there was one more white paper at the end of that 8-year period, and that white paper came out in 2013. As I said, the terms of trade had already gone in the wrong direction, and as a result, there was extra money available. The 2013 white paper, in terms of capability, basically continued the plans of the 2009 white paper. There are a few things that were adjusted. There's some things you could argue were a little bit more ambitious, but if you wanted to talk about aggregate costs, they were aiming absolutely in the same ballpark. What did it do in terms of money? Well, it didn't do anything in terms of money. It kept very quiet about it and said, you have to wait and see in the budget. When the budget came out, there was 6 years' worth of funding in aggregate provided, and you could work it out and subtract one from the other. There was a very substantial difference between the money that was provided in the 2013 white paper and what was planned in the 2009 white paper. Well, it doesn't add up, does it? If your plans stay the same, but you've got substantially less money, it means there's no way you can deliver it. So for that reason, the 2013 white paper was, among people who worry about defence issues, wasn't taken all that seriously. It was dead in the water from the get-go because it was manifestly and transparently underfunded. Not long after that, of course, we went into the 2013 election campaign. The 2013 election campaign turned out to be a pretty exciting one for defence. On the second or third last day of the campaign, at the official campaign launch, everyone know why the campaign launches are always right near the end of the campaign? I'll leave it to you as a homework problem. It's a great answer. The then opposition leader, Mr. Abbott, stood up and in one sentence made more promises than you could expect in a whole speech. Within a decade, the budget surplus will be 1% of GDP, defence spending will be 2% of GDP, the private health rebate will be fully restored, and each year government will be a smaller percentage of the economy. Well, the last one's already been broken. Government spending's already expanded from where it was back then. But even the other three are remarkably ambitious things to achieve, even giving yourself a decade to move forward. The 2% figure had been part of the defence debate for a number of years. It has its heritage in the negotiations between the United States and NATO over burden sharing. It had become a de facto benchmark. Europeans would say de facto, the Americans would say benchmark. And it had entered the Australian discussion through people like Richard Armitage suggesting that we should perhaps aspire to do the same things that they aspire the Europeans to do. So both sides of politics at that point had both said, yes, we aspire to spend 2% of GDP, and there's normally a caveat. We aspire to do so when conditions are right, when economic circumstances allow. Well, there was no caveat here. This was unambiguous, this was black and white. He placed a bet down on the table, 2% of GDP. Well, a lot's happened since then. We've had a change of Prime Minister, and we've had a new white paper. And the new white paper came out in in February this year. And like all good books, Lord of the Rings, 50 Shades of Grey, it's a trilogy. And the three parts, they're all promised, so full points to the government for delivering. The white paper you know about, and I'll talk about the funding in there. It's probably worth saying a little bit about both of these items. Defence industry policy, although it's got some new bells and whistles in it, largely is a piece of continuity in terms of what it says. What's happened since then, between February and now, I think we've seen some new developments, some emerging trends in defence industry policy, which really are quite different to the strictures of the largely economically rational defence industry policy statement we got. We've got an integrated investment plan. Integrated investment plan sounds a wonderful thing. It brings together the facilities program and the capital equipment program together in one place for the first time. That's probably a good thing from Defence's internal point of view. They can now, within their own processes, more carefully coordinate the investments they make in facilities and those they make in equipment, and they can make trade-offs one within the other. But in terms of a public document, the integrated investment plan was a bit of a letdown. There's a constant battle, and there's been a constant battle since 2000 about the disclosure of capability planning information. And there's a variety of audiences out there. Industry, for one, would like to know what's coming up so that they can do their planning, they can perhaps even make some investments, they can begin building the human capital that would be necessary to execute projects. So they want to know what's going on. And from my point of view, as a commentator on defence, I want to know what the plans are so I can try and hold defence to account on whether they deliver on those plans or not. Integrated investment plan, I'm afraid, is a disappointment on both fronts. I don't think it provides industry with as much information as the old defence capability plan used to. And it's certainly, from my point of view, in terms of looking at scheduling of projects and in-service dates, it's a very sparse document in terms of concrete information. It doesn't even have project numbers. Anyway, let's get back to the white paper. Rather than jump in and show you the white paper as a whole, which I'll do in a moment, I want to focus in first on just this 2-year period. The current financial year we're in now, which will end on 30 June, and the financial year beginning 1 July, which will be the first year of implementation of the 2016 white paper. If you look closely there, you'll see that the second bar is below the first bar. That's because it's been corrected for the effect of inflation. To give you the raw numbers, next year's defence budget will be $32.4 billion. It will represent 1.88% of GDP. Share of Commonwealth spend about 7.3%, and real growth on the prior year, it will contract by 0.5%. In terms of GDP share, we're at 1.94 at the moment. It's going to go down to 1.88. It's a bit surprising. Here we are, we've got new defence white paper. We're going to go to 2% of GDP. we're down on the starting blocks, get ready, get set, and we fall over. It's hardly an auspicious start. Well, there's some explanation behind it. Defence has formally reduced its budget by about $320 million this year, in effect handing back that much money. At the same time, they've foregone foreign exchange supplementation, which probably represented another $80 million or so that they would have got, and they also underachieved on their capital asset sales, which means they didn't get as much revenue from selling assets. So between $400 and $500 million worth of underspend. As a result of that underspend, the decision, at the same time as that underspend occurred, a decision has been taken to defer $500 million of spending planned for next year into the year after. Next year was to have a boost of $700 million granted by the white paper. Only $200 million of that will now be spent. The other $500 has been pushed into the next year. Not because the government is squirreling the money away to do something else with it, because we're deeply in deficit. It costs nothing. Government can provide the money. All signs are that the money has been deferred because Defence is simply unable to spend the money. Let's look at the big picture now, having got that near-term data point out of the way. The white paper includes, in nominal terms, $448 billion of spending over the decade. In terms of today's dollars, it shrinks down a bit once you take the inflation out of it, and it's just under $400 billion over 10 years. So an average of about $40 billion a year is going to be spent over the next decade. The increase in absolute terms in the budget will be $14.8 billion, representing 4.3% per annum growth. Now, if you look back to what I said about the 2000s, that's a slower rate of growth. We achieved 5.3% there. Now we're only aiming for 4.3%. I wouldn't take too much comfort from that for a couple of reasons. One is, and I'll come to it in a moment, capital investment will increase much more strongly this time, and capital investment is the area of risk when it comes to not being able to spend money. The other thing is that absolutes matter. A lot of this growth is in capital investment, and the ability, the capacity of local industry and of the capability acquisition and sustainment group to shift that money depends on the absolute size, not on the percentage change. So it's right from the very start, it's a big challenge. But let me go from being glass half full to being a glass half full, half empty to half full. You can see here the 2% of GDP intersects with planned funding in 2020-21. That's 3 years earlier than was promised. Now, that sounds like great news, doesn't it? Well, it sounds like great news till you get the explanation. What I have there is the white paper funding, and superimposed on it are successive projections of nominal GDP beginning in 2012, then 13, 14, 15, 16. And what you can see is there's been a very substantial revision downwards of gross domestic product over that 5-year period. At the same time, the Australian dollar has depreciated, and the defence budget has been buoyed up by supplementation it gets to maintain its buying power in the face of changed foreign exchange. Out here, you're probably looking in the vicinity of $1 billion, maybe $1.5 billion in foreign exchange supplementation. You can't read it that far out from the budget papers, but certainly in the early years, the growth is well over $1 billion in foreign exchange. So with GDP share going down and foreign exchange supplementation pushing the budget up, I should stress, with no additional buying power. That's what the foreign exchange supplementation for. It just allows you to tread water. Well, you hit 2% of GDP earlier. Pretty clearly what's happened is the funding envelope for defence was fixed back in 2014. Growth expectations have deteriorated over that period, and foreign exchange has pushed up the nominal value of the defence budget, so we get to 2% of GDP earlier without actually getting any more spending power along the journey. Looking at the internals of the defence budget over that period, and the white paper I must say, from a financial point of view, is quite transparent. It provides a layer cake graph of spending on personnel, capital investment, sustainment, and some bibs and bobs that they call operating expenditure. So you've got to ask, is it affordable? Well, on the one hand, we know that Defence engaged some quite globally recognised experts in defence costing to assist them with the costing of the white paper, and they're probably in a better position now, even without that help, to understand their costs than they have been in the past. So let's have a look at these various components and see what they tell us. The capital investment will grow at 7.7% per annum. That's in real terms. Back in the 2000s, it increased more or less in tandem with the overall budget. So the rate of growth of capital investment is going to be faster this time, and that's going to be a challenge. Sustainment 5.7, that's consistent with recent trends and consistent with the coming online of a whole range of new capability classes. Personnel is going to increase by 0.25% per annum. If we actually do it on a per capita basis, because the size of the Defence Force is planned to grow, you actually find it declines by 0.25% per annum. You scratch your head and say, how can that be? Well, on the one hand, Defence has taken some steps to simplify its civilian rank structures and remove people in middle management areas, but there's only about 500 people out of 8,700 in those middle management areas that have been lost. The thing that makes me worried about this is that if you read the white paper in the personnel chapter, it tells you about a future of high-tech warfare, about people needing new skills, about the organisation wanting to manage itself more effectively. All of these things mean more human capital, people with better skills than they've had in the past. So I think, if anything, there's going to be pressures here on the personnel side in the years ahead. On the capital side, I wouldn't want to second-guess globally recognised experts, but if you look at the investment plan and you look through the projects in there, you've got to scratch your head and wonder, how are they going to spend that much money on some of those things? For example, there's, was it $4 billion odd, put down for an upgrade of the weapons system on the air warfare destroyers. The vessels only cost us $9 billion. Japan has done just about every extensive upgrade of the Aegis weapon system you can think of, and they've done it for, like, at most $500 million per vessel. You look at the replenishment vessels, they're in there at $1 to $2 billion. The contract was signed for, $650 million. So I think there's a bit of fat in the provisions made for capital investment. That's good. They might have to divert some money to pay for people out of that. But affordability isn't the only thing that you can come a cropper with. As we saw back in the 2000s, our first lesson was that it can be hard to spend money sometimes. Well, here's a graph I'd like to show you. What we have here is the number of project approvals that have been disclosed in over a 12-year period or so. We've got second pass and first pass. Here's what's planned for next year. Now, what I've put up here is I've called catch-up. These numbers here, second pass and first pass, are in the portfolio budget statements. They're in black ink. What up here is those things in the integrated investment plan that were supposed to be approved this financial year that haven't been approved. So to get back on track, we've got to approve them next year as well. So that gives you somewhere between 33, if you exclude the catch-up projects, and 44 projects to approve next year, against an average of just under 18 for the last decade. So it's a bit of a haunting reminder of the 2000s, when the critical path to spending money and building the ADF was project approvals. Now, at the best of times, this would be a stretch target and a half. But just as back in the 2000s when we had the CNAD reforms, what we have in defence at the moment is the first principle review reforms. Now, those reforms, and I see General Lays here, one of the authors, those reforms will, in the fullness of time, we hope, improve the way defence is managed. But there's no escaping the reality that when you disband the Capability Development Group, when you change from DMO outside of the organisation to a CASG inside of the organisation, and you implement a new capability development life cycle which was only finalised at the beginning of April this year, that you're juggling things at the same time as you're trying to run. It's going to only make it more difficult to deliver this prodigious number of projects to be approved. And the approval of projects is absolutely on the critical path. If you look 4 years hence at the capital investment program, more than half the money is allocated for unapproved projects. If these projects don't get approved, that planned money cannot be spent. There's other challenges ahead. Here's the Prime Minister and the Minister for Industry and the Minister for Defence at a recent announcement concerning submarines down in South Australia. If you look at what's happened over the last 6 months or so, if you look past February when the Defence Industry Policy Statement came out, there's been a change in sentiment. Watershed or sea change may be too much of a phrase to put on it, but certainly the government is much more enthusiastic about doing things in Australia. And you can find on the record statements by both the Minister for Defence and from the Prime Minister about wanting to do as much work in Australia as possible. Okay, well that's their policy. At the same time, one of the things that has been preserved from the Defence Industry Policy Statement is an unashamed embrace of innovation. The word innovation occurs in the Defence Industry Policy Statement 186 times. The word off the shelf occurs once. So we've gone from a period of time where we've been very successfully buying things like C-17s, buying things like Super Hornets off the shelf from the United States. They've been arriving here, we send a cheque, the money's out the door, the capability's in the warfighter's hands. We're now moving to a situation where we're going to do a lot more stuff in country. Some of it's policy, some of it is, for example, with our submarines, unless we build them ourselves, we're not going to get the submarines we want. Nonetheless, if we look back over time and we ask, what are the projects that have caused trouble? What are the projects which have been slow to deliver? They're the projects that we've done in country. They're the projects with a high developmental component in it. They're projects with Australian unique requirements. And we're moving into a phase of large projects which have at least two of those characteristics each. So not only have we set ourselves a stretch goal in terms of approving projects, once we get these underway, they are going to contain significant risk. And the final question you've always got to ask is, will the money be forthcoming? Well, here's a chart of revenues and payments for the federal government going back a long way, and you can see when revenues fall below payments, you're in deficit. So here's deficits, here's surpluses, deficits. At the moment, the projections are that we'll be able to get back into surplus in about 2021, the same year that we reached 2% of GDP. Now, it might be that that's an unfortunate coincidence for those people who think 2% of GDP is a magic number, because as we go forward and as it gets closer and closer, as the potential to get back into surplus becomes within reach, the same temptation will emerge as occurred back in 2012. In fact, if you go through and work out when the next election is, if you wanted to go into the next election with a surplus in hand, you'd have to do it in 2019, 2020. So it could be just in the next term of government we see that the priority for delivering a surplus will supersede that of defence. That's not necessarily a bad thing from a national perspective. Paying down debt, getting the budget under control, contributes to our economic security. But by the same token, every dollar we don't spend on defence now, every dollar we push into the future, inevitably means the capability that's planned for the ADF will be delivered later than was originally envisaged. I'll leave it there and happy to take your questions.